Oligarchy is worse than you think. A materialist analysis of corporate power in America introduction. Symptoms, not causes. Johnny Harris's video, Oligarchy is worse than you think, arrives at a moment when even mainstream commentators can no longer ignore what working people have known for decades. America is not a democracy in any meaningful sense. The video documents the staggering concentration of wealth and political power in the hands of a tiny billionaire class. It shows us the numbers, that 3 men hold more wealth than the bottom half of the country, that a handful of super donors finance presidential campaigns, that media empires answer to their billionaire owners. These facts are true, disturbing, and deserve serious attention. But the video commits a fundamental error. It treats oligarchy as a corruption of American democracy, a deviation from the ideal. It implies that if we could just pass the right campaign finance reform and elect the right candidates, we could fix what is broken. This is an ideological dead end. It mistakes symptoms for causes, surface for structure. The truth is that oligarchy is not a disease that has infected American capitalism. It is the natural, predictable, and historically inevitable outcome of capitalism itself. The concentration of wealth, the capture of the state by corporate interests, the hollowing out of democratic institutions, the control of information by a tiny elite. These are not bugs in the system. They are features. They are what capitalism does when left to operate according to its own internal logic. This analysis seeks to go beyond the frame that Johnny Harris offers. It will examine oligarchy not as a moral failure or a legal loophole, but as a structural necessity of a system designed to concentrate wealth and power upward. It will use the tools of historical materialism, the analysis of how economic systems shape political and social life, to understand why oligarchy is not an accident, but an inevitability under capitalism. And it will argue that the only meaningful response is not piecemeal reform that leaves the underlying structure intact, but a fundamental redistribution of power from the corporate elite to working people. What is oligarchy? Not just corruption, but capitalism itself. The word oligarchy comes from the ancient Greek, rule by the few. Most people understand it in moral terms, a society where a small group of wealthy people by political influence subvert democratic processes and protect their interests at everyone else's expense. Johnny Harris's video operates largely within this framework. It presents oligarchy as a deviation from democratic norms, a violation of American principles. But this framework is fundamentally wrong. Oligarchy is not a corruption of capitalism. It is capitalism reaching its logical conclusion. To understand why, we have to look at what capitalism actually is. Capitalism is not simply free markets. That is an ideological description. In material terms, capitalism is a system in which a small class owns the means of production, the factories, offices, land, technology, media platforms, financial institutions, while the vast majority must sell their labor power to survive. This is not an incidental feature. It is its defining characteristic. Every economic system in human history has produced a dominant class that controls society's surplus wealth. Under feudalism, it was the landed aristocracy extracting rents from peasants. Under slavery, it was the slave owners controlling human beings as property. Under capitalism, it is the capitalist class, the owners of capital, extracting value from the labor of working people. The form changes, but the underlying dynamic remains. A minority controls the resources everyone depends on, and that control translates into political and social power. This brings us to an insight that Johnny Harris's video misses entirely. The relationship between economic power and political power is not accidental or corrupt. It is structural. In a capitalist society, the state does not float above the economy as a neutral referee. The state is shaped by the same economic forces that shape everything else. The people who own the economy have an overwhelming advantage in shaping the state's priorities, policies, and personnel, not because they are evil, but because the system gives them the resources to do so. Consider how this works in practice. Political campaigns require enormous sums of money. That money comes overwhelmingly from the wealthy. Politicians who want to be elected must cater to the interests of their funders. This is not personal corruption. It is a structural reality. Even a well-intentioned politician who wants to serve the public must first win an election, and winning an election requires access to capital. The gatekeepers of that capital have power over the process before it even begins. Beyond campaign finance, the structural power of capital operates more subtly. Corporations do not need to bribe politicians. They simply threaten to move jobs overseas, cut investment, or relocate to a more business-friendly jurisdiction. These threats are credible because capital is mobile in a way that labor is not. A factory can be moved to another country. A financial firm can shift operations to another city. But workers cannot so easily leave. They are tied to their communities, their homes, their families. This asymmetry gives capital an enormous structural advantage in any political contest. This is what historical materialism teaches. The economic base of society, the way production is organized and controlled, determines the superstructure of politics, law, culture, and ideology. Oligarchy is not a superstructure problem that can be fixed by tweaking the superstructure. It flows from the base. As long as a tiny minority controls the productive resources of society, that minority will also control political power. Oligarchy is not a bug. It is the system functioning exactly as designed. The historical evidence for this is overwhelming. Every capitalist society has developed oligarchic tendencies. The United States is not unique. It simply has fewer countervailing pressures than other wealthy countries. In Europe, organized labor movements won significant concessions. In the post-war period, universal healthcare, strong labor protections, robust public services, that created some check on corporate power. In the United States, the labor movement was weaker, the Cold War repression of left-wing politics was more intense, and the post-war compromises were more limited. The result is that American capitalism has had fewer restraints on its oligarchic tendencies. But the tendency is present in all capitalist societies and has been intensifying everywhere as the organized power of working people has declined. Johnny Harris shows us the result of this process. He documents the symptoms, the billionaires, the super PACs, the lobbying spending, the media consolidation. But he does not explain the cause. The cause is capitalism itself. As long as we have a system in which a tiny class owns the productive resources and the vast majority must sell their labor to survive, we will have oligarchy. Not as an unfortunate accident, but as a structural necessity. How it works. The machinery of elite capture with an understanding of oligarchy as a structural feature of capitalism, we can examine the specific mechanisms through which elite capture operates. Johnny Harris touches on several, presenting them as discrete problems. In reality, they form an integrated system, a comprehensively engineered machinery that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Campaign finance. The sieve through which policy must pass. The most visible mechanism is campaign finance. The 2010 Citizens United decision is often cited as the moment the floodgates opened. By allowing corporations and unions to spend unlimited money on independent political expenditures, the court removed one of the last legal barriers to translating economic power directly into political power. But Citizens United did not create the problem. It removed a constraint on a dynamic that had been operating for much longer. The scale of money in American politics is staggering. In the 2020 election cycle, total federal campaign spending exceeded $14 billion. The 2024 cycle shattered even that figure. The vast majority comes from a tiny fraction of the population. According to research from the Brennan Center, just 0.05% of Americans, roughly 1 in every 2,000, account for the majority of campaign contributions. A handful of billionaires can pour hundreds of millions of dollars into the political system, effectively determining which candidates candidates are viable and which issues are debated. The implications are devastating for any pretense of democratic equality. When political campaigns cost this much, politicians are not accountable to their constituents. They are accountable to their funders. This is not a hypothesis. Empirical research demonstrates that the policy preferences of the wealthy have outsized influence on legislative outcomes, while the preferences of ordinary Americans have essentially no independent effect. One landmark study by political scientists Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page examined nearly 1,800 policy outcomes and found that economic elites and organized business interests had substantial impact on public policy, while average citizens had little to no independent influence. The United States does not have a democracy captured by oligarchs. It has an oligarchy that occasionally holds elections. Lobbying, the fine print of corporate governance. If campaign finance is the sieve through which corporate influence enters the political system, lobbying shapes the fine print. The lobbying industry in Washington has grown into a multi-billion-dollar shadow government. There are more than 12,000 registered lobbyists, roughly 22 for every member of Congress. But this dramatically understates the scale, as it excludes thousands of unregistered lobbyists, public relations firms, think tanks, and law firms that do essentially the same work, shaping legislation to benefit corporate clients. The results are visible in every area of policy. The tax code is a maze of loopholes and exemptions, each carved out by a lobbyist for a specific corporate interest. The pharmaceutical industry spends hundreds of millions annually on lobbying and has blocked every significant effort to lower drug prices. The financial industry wrote the regulations that were supposed to rein it in after the 2008 crash and watered them down at every opportunity. The fossil fuel industry has spent decades blocking climate action and funding disinformation. What makes the system so effective is not merely the money. It is the revolving door between government and industry. People move seamlessly from regulatory authority into high-paying jobs in the industries they once regulated, and from corporate boardrooms into government power. The financial industry has had an especially tight grip on the Treasury Department. Nearly every Treasury Secretary in modern history has come from Wall Street or returned there after service. The same pattern holds for the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Defense, the Food and Drug Administration, and virtually every regulatory agency. This revolving door creates regulators who fundamentally identify with the interests of the industries they are supposed to regulate, because they either came from those industries or expect to return. Media ownership. The control of information, perhaps the most insidious mechanism, is media ownership. In a democracy, the free flow of information is supposed to be the bedrock of informed citizenship. But when a handful of billionaires control the major media platforms, the information reaching the public is filtered through their interests. Johnny Harris mentions several prominent examples: Jeff Bezos' ownership of the Washington Post, Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, Rupert Murdoch's control of Fox News, and the Wall Street Journal. These are not isolated. The media landscape has undergone decades of consolidation. A handful of conglomerates, Comcast, Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, News Corp, control the vast majority of what Americans see, read, and hear. Local newspapers have been gutted by hedge funds and private equity firms that strip them for profit. Independent media struggle to survive on advertising revenue captured by tech monopolies. The result is a media environment that systematically narrows acceptable debate. Issues that threaten corporate power, the wealth gap, labor rights, monopoly power, structural causes of poverty, are marginalized or ignored. Coverage that does address these issues frames them in individualistic terms: greedy CEOs, corrupt politicians, regulatory loopholes, not the system itself. The fundamental questions about who owns the economy and how that translates into political power are almost never asked, because asking them would threaten the interests of those who control the system. Most journalists are sincere professionals trying to report the truth, but they operate within a structure that constrains what they can say. A reporter who consistently challenges corporate power will find their stories buried and their career stalled. A reporter who stays within acceptable bounds, treating capitalism as given and focusing on marginal policy disputes, will advance. The system does not need explicit censorship. It simply makes it much easier for conforming voices to succeed. The capture of both major political parties is the logical endpoint. It is common to hear that Democrats represent working people and Republicans represent business, but the data tells a different story. Both parties are funded by the same billionaire class. Both respond to the same corporate donors. Both operate within the same narrow range of acceptable policy debate, excluding any fundamental challenge to corporate power. The difference between the parties is real on social and cultural issues. It matters intensely for the rights of women, LGBTQ+ people, immigrants, and other marginalized groups. But on the economic questions that define the distribution of wealth and power, tax policy, trade, financial regulation, antitrust, labor law, the differences are far smaller than the rhetoric suggests. The Democratic Party has moved steadily rightward on economics since the 1970s, abandoning the New Deal commitments that once gave it a genuinely pro-worker orientation. The Republican Party has moved even further right, embracing radical deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, and union busting that would have been extreme a generation ago. The result is a political system in which neither party challenges the fundamental distribution of wealth and power. Working people are offered a choice between two factions of the same corporate elite. This is not democracy. This is oligarchy with a choice of managers. The consequences, what oligarchy costs, the mechanisms of oligarchic control, can seem abstract and distant from daily life. But the consequences are anything but abstract. They are measured in lives shortened, bodies broken, families destroyed, futures foreclosed. Healthcare. Profit before people. The United States spends more on healthcare per capita than any other developed country. Roughly $12,500 per person per year, nearly double the average of comparable nations. Yet Americans die younger, get sicker, and have worse health outcomes across virtually every metric. Infant mortality is higher. Maternal mortality is shockingly high, especially for women of color. Life expectancy has been declining for 3 consecutive years, unprecedented in the modern era for a wealthy country. The reason is not a mystery. The American healthcare system is not designed to produce health. It is designed to produce profit for insurance companies, pharmaceutical corporations, hospital chains, and the array of middlemen extracting value from every stage of the process. Insurance companies spend billions annually denying claims and limiting coverage. Pharmaceutical companies charge Americans 3 to 10 times what they charge people in other countries for the same drugs. For-profit hospital executives pay themselves millions while pricing basic care out of reach for millions. The oligarchic capture of the political system is why this continues. Every other developed country has some form of universal healthcare. The United States does not because it is unaffordable or unworkable, but because the insurance and pharmaceutical industries have the political power to block it. They spend hundreds of millions on lobbying and campaign contributions to ensure no meaningful reform passes, even as the evidence for universal systems grows overwhelming. Millions go without needed care, tens of thousands die preventable deaths, families are bankrupted by medical bills. Also, corporate executives and shareholders can maintain their profits. The housing crisis. Shelter as a commodity. Housing is a human need as fundamental as food and water. But in the United States, housing has been transformed into a financial asset, a vehicle for speculation, a source of profit. The cost of housing has risen far faster than wages for decades. In 1960, the median home cost roughly twice the median household income. Today, it costs more than 5 times. Nearly half of all renters are cost-burdened, spending more than 30% of income on housing. Homelessness has risen for 4 consecutive years, now affecting more than 650,000 people on any given night. The cause is traced directly to concentrated economic power. Large corporate landlords have bought hundreds of thousands of single-family homes, converting them into rentals and driving up prices for first-time buyers. Private equity firms have acquired massive rental portfolios and used algorithms to coordinate rent increases. The financial industry created the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, triggering foreclosures that devastated working-class communities and disproportionately affected Black and Latino families, stripping them of generations of accumulated wealth. The policy response reveals the same pattern of capture. The federal government spends more than $200 billion annually on housing subsidies, but most goes to wealthy homeowners through the mortgage interest deduction. Direct assistance for low-income renters is dramatically underfunded. Only 1 in 4 eligible households receives any help. Zoning laws in wealthy communities block affordable housing, protecting property values for existing homeowners. The political system cannot address these issues because the interests of landlords, developers, financial institutions, and wealthy homeowners consistently outweigh those of renters and the unhoused. Student debt. The education trap. The student debt crisis is another consequence. The United States has more than $1.7 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, held by more than 40 million borrowers. The average borrower owes nearly $40,000. This debt delays homeownership, suppresses entrepreneurship, depresses consumer spending, and traps millions in financial insecurity for decades. The crisis originates in the same dynamic: the withdrawal of public investment and the transfer of costs from the state to individuals, as state governments have cut funding. For public universities, accelerating dramatically after 2008, tuition has risen far faster than inflation. Students have been forced to borrow ever larger sums. The federal government expanded access to loans, creating a system that subsidizes the extraction of wealth from young people by educational institutions and the financial industry. The failure to address the crisis is a textbook case of oligarchy politics. Polling consistently shows that a majority of Americans support significant debt cancellation and free public college. But these policies have been blocked. The financial industry profits from the student loan system, private universities resist any reform that might reduce tuition revenue, and conservative forces oppose any expansion of public investment. The result is that millions of young people are saddled with debt for seeking an education. Debt that cannot be discharged in bankruptcy, that follows them for life, that compounds the inequality they were born into. Mass incarceration. The carceral state, the United States, has the highest incarceration rate of any country, and by a wide margin. With less than 5% of the global population, it holds nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. More than 2 million people are behind bars on any given day. Millions more are under some form of criminal justice supervision. Mass incarceration is not a response to rising crime. Crime rates have fallen dramatically since the 1990s, but incarceration continued rising for another 2 decades. The prison population exploded because of policy choices: the war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, the militarization of policing, the expansion of pretrial detention, the privatization of prisons. The private prison industry profits from high incarceration rates and lobbies aggressively to maintain them. Prison guards unions are among the most powerful political forces in states like California and New York and consistently oppose reform. For-profit bail companies, electronic monitoring firms, and the entire punishment industry have a stake in the status quo. The racial dimensions are impossible to ignore. Black Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white Americans. 1 in 3 Black men born in the United States can expect to spend time in prison. The criminal justice system functions as a mechanism of racial control, a successor to slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation. The war on drugs was explicitly designed and implemented to target Black communities. The racial wealth gap, housing segregation, and employment discrimination are all reinforced by a system that systematically targets people of color. The hollowing out of democracy is the thread connecting all of these consequences. When the political system is captured by corporate interests, it cannot respond to people's needs. Healthcare remains unaffordable. Housing remains inaccessible. Education remains a source of debt rather than opportunity. The criminal justice system remains a tool of repression. Inequality deepens. Life expectancy falls. Democracy becomes an empty shell, a ritual of voting that changes nothing about the distribution of power. This is the reality Johnny Harris's video gestures toward, but does not fully confront. The consequences of oligarchy are not abstract statistics. They are the reason people are dying younger, drowning in debt, losing their homes, and being locked in cages. They are the reason the American dream has become a cruel joke for everyone born outside the top of the economic pyramid. What's to be done? Beyond reform to transformation. Johnny Harris's video ends with a call for reform. This is the standard conclusion of liberal documentary treatments of oligarchy. Get money out of politics, strengthen democracy, restore captured institutions. These recommendations are not wrong. They point toward solutions that would improve people's lives, but they are radically insufficient to the scale of the problem. Consider what would actually be required to break the grip of oligarchy. It would require, at a minimum, public financing of all elections with strict contribution limits, and a complete ban on corporate and dark money. Aggressive antitrust policy that breaks up monopolies in technology, media, finance, and every other sector. A tax system that reverses the decades-long upward shift of wealth, with steeply progressive income taxes, a robust wealth tax, and elimination of loopholes that allow corporations and the wealthy to evade their obligations. Universal public healthcare that removes profit from medical care. Free public education from preschool through university. A massive public housing program that treats shelter as a right, not a commodity. And a fundamental transformation of the criminal justice system that ends mass incarceration and addresses root causes rather than punishing consequences. Even this ambitious list does not go far enough, because even if all these reforms were implemented, the underlying economic structure would remain unchanged. A small class would still own the productive resources. The vast majority would still depend on selling their labor to survive. The structural power of capital, the ability to threaten disinvestment, move jobs, shape the terms of economic life, would remain intact. Over time, that structural power would reassert itself, eroding the reforms, finding new channels for influence, gradually reestablishing oligarchic control. The history of the 20th century demonstrates this pattern. The New Deal reforms of the 1930s, won through decades of working class struggle, created a period of relative equality and prosperity. But those reforms did not change who owned the economy. Capital regrouped, organized, and counterattacked. By the 1970s, a coordinated assault on labor unions, progressive taxation, and public investment was underway. By the 2000s, most New Deal gains had been erased. The underlying distribution of power had not changed, so the surface distribution of wealth eventually returned to its natural state. This is why piecemeal reform, however well-intentioned, is insufficient. The only meaningful response to oligarchy is a fundamental redistribution of economic power. Not just better rules for the same game, but a different game entirely. This means building institutions that give working people genuine control over the economy. Worker-owned cooperatives, unionized workplaces with real bargaining power, publicly owned utilities and services, democratically controlled investment funds, community land trusts that take housing out of the speculative market. It means transforming vast concentrations of private wealth into democratically controlled common wealth. It means building a society in which the people who do the work also make the decisions about what is produced, how it is produced, and where the benefits go. Democratic reform of the political system, campaign finance reform, voting rights, anti-corruption measures is important and worth fighting for. These reforms make it easier for working people to organize, to be heard, to build power. But they are means, not ends. The end is a society in which economic power is widely and democratically distributed, and political power follows from that distribution. The end is a society in which no one has the wealth to buy elections, control information, or threaten communities with disinvestment, because no one has that concentration of wealth in the first place. This vision is often dismissed as utopian, but the status quo is utopian in a worse sense. It assumes a society can remain democratic while a tiny minority controls the economy, which is a contradiction in terms. A society in which a handful